Elon Musk helps struggling single mom. What happens next will shock you. The cramped waiting room at the local community aid center buzzed with tension. Posters detailing housing assistance and childcare resources peeled slightly at the corners of the beige walls. A fan in the corner struggled to churn the heavy air, and the sound of muffled chatter filled the space as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Among them sat Claire Thompson, a young mother with worry etched deep into her face. Her toddler, Aiden, squirmed restlessly in her lap, his chubby hands clutching at her necklace. The little boy had been fussy all morning, his cries loud enough to attract glares from others waiting. Claire muttered soothing words under her breath, but it was clear she was barely holding herself together. The past week had been a blur of eviction notices, unpaid bills, and rejection letters from jobs she was overqualified for. This was her last stop before despair set in completely. Across the room, a man who looked vaguely familiar sat quietly. His black t-shirt and jeans didn't exactly scream wealth, but there was something about his presence. Calm, observing, and entirely out of place. He glanced around the room, making mental notes as his gaze swept over the desperation in the eyes of everyone present. When his eyes briefly met Claire's, he offered a small smile, but she quickly looked away, self-conscious about her tear-streaked face. Number 42, the receptionist called, her tone flat and mechanical. Claire scrambled to her feet, hoisting Aiden onto her hip while juggling a battered diaper bag. As she walked toward the desk, her worn sneakers squeaked against the linoleum floor. The receptionist barely looked up as Claire explained her situation, stumbling over her words in an effort to be both concise and convincing. The response was curt. They were out of emergency funds for the month. "But I don't have anywhere to go," Claire said, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You can try again next month," the receptionist replied, her eyes already shifting to the next file on her desk. Claire stood frozen, the weight of her circumstances crushing her. Aiden, sensing her distress, started to wail. Her shoulders hunched as she turned back to the waiting area, biting her lip to hold back tears. The man in the black t-shirt stood up then, walking toward the desk with a purposeful stride. Claire noticed him out of the corner of her eye but didn't think much of it. Probably just another person desperate for help. What caught her attention was the sudden change in the receptionist's demeanor. Her previously detached expression shifted to one of wide-eyed recognition. Sir, can I help you?" the receptionist stammered, her voice faltering. The man leaned on the counter slightly, his posture relaxed but his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I'm just here to observe today," he said, his tone polite but firm. "But I couldn't help overhearing. You're out of funds?" "Completely. Yes, sir," the receptionist replied, her voice almost a whisper now. She seemed unsure whether to maintain her professional tone or act deferential. Claire frowned, her curiosity piqued despite herself. She shifted Aiden to her other hip and watched as the man continued to question the receptionist. Who was this guy, and why did he suddenly command so much attention? The receptionist fumbled with some papers before adding, "The budget cuts this year have been severe, and unfortunately, there's only so much we can do." The man nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Then, turning slightly, he addressed the room. "Is this the situation for everyone here? You've all been told there's no funding left." A murmur rippled through the waiting area. Heads nodded hesitantly, but no one seemed willing to speak up. Claire's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if the stranger's intervention would help, but it was the first time someone had voiced the frustration she'd been feeling for weeks. "What's your name?" the man asked Claire, his tone softening as his eyes locked on hers. She hesitated, unsure why he was singling her out. "Claire," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Claire," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "And this little guy?" "Aiden," she said, adjusting the toddler on her hip. The man nodded again, then turned back to the receptionist. "How many people are in her situation today?" "Ballpark." The receptionist shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. I'd have to check our records, but it's been a busy week. A lot of families are struggling." He sighed, a look of genuine concern crossing his face. And how much would it take to make a difference right now? Enough to cover the emergencies you've had to turn away. The room went silent. Claire's mouth fell open slightly. Who asks that kind of question? And why did he sound so serious? The receptionist blinked, clearly caught off guard. That's not something I can calculate off the top of my head, she stammered. Ballpark it, he said again. His tone still polite, but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't dropping the subject. Claire couldn't take it anymore. Who are you? She blurted out, her voice cutting through the tension. She immediately regretted it, feeling like she'd overstepped. But to her surprise, the man turned to her with an easy smile. Elon, he said simply. Her stomach dropped. Elon, as in Elon Musk? She stared at him, trying to reconcile the unassuming man in front of her with the billionaire she'd seen on TV and in headlines. She wasn't the only one who realized it either. A low buzz of recognition spread through the room as others began to piece it together. Elon Musk turned back to the receptionist. So, a rough estimate. The receptionist, now visibly flustered, rattled off a number. It was a big one. Claire's heart sank. There was no way anyone could help with that kind of money. Not even him. Musk didn't flinch. All right, he said, pulling out his phone. Let's fix it. The tension in the room thickened as Elon Musk stood at the receptionist's desk, his phone in hand. Claire watched in disbelief, her mind racing to process what was happening. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A publicity stunt? Whatever it was, it had the entire room on edge. The receptionist, now visibly flustered, shifted nervously behind the counter. Sir, I'm not sure we can even accept private donations like that. There's a process, she stammered, her voice quivering. Elon raised an eyebrow, his demeanor calm but unyielding. I'm not asking about process. I'm asking how we can fix this. Today, the murmurs in the room grew louder. People were craning their necks, trying to get a better look at the man who had just disrupted their quiet despair. For many of them, he was a distant figure, a name tied to rockets and electric cars, not someone who would show up at a local aid center. Claire tightened her grip on Aiden, who had finally stopped fussing, his big eyes locked on Musk. I'll need to speak with the supervisor, the receptionist finally said, her voice trembling. She turned and disappeared into the back office, leaving the room in an awkward silence. It was then that another voice broke through the stillness. What's he doing here? A man's gruff tone echoed from the corner of the room. Claire turned to see an older man with a worn baseball cap and a sneer on his face. His arms were crossed over his chest as he glared at Musk. I bet he's just here for the cameras, the man continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. Rich guys like him don't do anything without a PR team watching. Claire felt a pang of anger rise in her chest. She didn't know Musk personally. Who did? But she didn't like the man's dismissive tone. Yet she said nothing, unwilling to draw attention to herself. Elon, however, seemed unfazed. He turned to the man and smiled politely. No cameras here, he said simply. Just trying to help. The man scoffed. Help? You don't know the first thing about struggle. You probably spent more on breakfast this morning than any of us make in a month. A few people murmured in agreement, and Claire felt the air grow heavier. It wasn't that the man was entirely wrong. Elon Musk was a billionaire after all, but his tone was cutting, filled with bitterness that made the room uncomfortable. Elon took a step closer to the man, his expression thoughtful. You're right, he said after a moment. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, but that's why I'm here. To listen, to understand. The man narrowed his eyes, clearly not expecting that response. Yeah, well, listening doesn't pay my rent, he muttered, slumping back into his chair. Before anyone could say more, the receptionist returned, followed by a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt who looked equally flustered. This is Mr. Carson, she said, gesturing toward the man. He's our center director. Carson stepped forward, adjusting his tie nervously as he extended a hand to Elon. Mr. Musk, it's an honor, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Call me Elon, Musk replied, shaking his hand firmly. I understand you're facing some funding challenges here. Carson nodded. glancing uneasily at the room full of people who were now hanging on every word. Yes, it's been a difficult year. Budget cuts, rising demand, it's been hard to keep up. We do the best we can, but there's only so much we can stretch. I'd like to help, Elon said simply, cutting to the point. I understand the number I heard earlier was an estimate, but if that's what it takes to keep this place running and meet the immediate needs, I'm prepared to cover it. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Claire's jaw dropped, and she wasn't alone. Even Carson seemed momentarily speechless. Mr. Musk, that's incredibly generous, but we can't just accept that kind of money without approval from our board. There are protocols, Carson stammered, his face reddening. Then call your board, Elon said, his tone calm but firm. I'll wait. Carson blinked, clearly caught off guard. It's not that simple, he began. But his words were interrupted by the man in the baseball cap, who had apparently had enough. Of course it's not simple, the man sneered. Because guys like you, he pointed at Carson, and guys like him, he jabbed a finger in Elon's direction, don't actually care about solving problems. You just want to look good doing it. Sir, that's enough, Carson said sharply, his professional veneer cracking. No, it's not enough, the man shot back, his voice rising. We've been sitting here for hours, and now we're supposed to believe that some billionaire is just going to swoop in and save the day? Give me a break. Claire felt her cheeks flush with anger. She glanced at Elon, expecting him to look offended, but instead, he seemed amused? No, not amused, curious. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand the man's outburst. What's your name? Elon asked, his voice calm but commanding. The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard. What does it matter? It matters, Elon replied, because I don't want to talk about you. I want to talk with you. The room fell silent again. All eyes were on the man, who finally muttered, Ray, Elon said, his tone almost gentle. You're right, I can't fix everything, but I can start here. And if you've got a better idea, I'm all ears. Ray stared at him, his jaw working as if he was trying to come up with a retort but couldn't find the words. After a long moment, he slumped back into his chair, muttering something under his breath. Elon turned back to Carson. Now, about that phone call? The room's air was thick with tension, a mix of disbelief, skepticism, and simmering frustration. While the receptionist nervously shuffled papers at her desk and Carson hesitated over what to do next, Ray's sneering voice broke through the quiet once again. Yeah, go ahead, call your board. Let's see if they even bother picking up, Ray muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his lips curling into a smirk. Rich people like to play savior until they realize it takes actual work. Elon glanced at Ray briefly but said nothing. Instead, he directed his focus back to Carson, whose hand hovered over the phone like it was a live grenade. I'm serious, Elon said, his tone steady. Make the call. Whatever red tape is holding this up, let's cut through it. Carson swallowed hard, visibly torn. His instinct to follow protocol was battling with the realization that this might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the struggling center. It's not just about the board's approval, he said, his voice wavering. There's also compliance, tax implications, legal reviews. Sounds like excuses. Ray cut in, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Big surprise. The guy with the fancy suit doesn't actually want to fix anything. Ray, that's enough, Claire snapped, surprising even herself. She didn't know why she felt compelled to defend Elon, but something about Ray's constant negativity grated on her. Ray turned his sharp gaze on her. And what do you know about it, huh? You're sitting here just like the rest of us, waiting for scraps. Claire's face burned, but before she could respond, Elon spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Ray, I get the sense that you've been let down before, probably more times than anyone here knows. But if all we do is tear each other down, how does that help? Ray's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Spare me the speeches, Musk. You think you can just throw money at problems and make them go away? That's not how the real world works. Elon crossed his arms and leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. You're right. Money alone doesn't solve anything, but it's a start. And maybe, just maybe, instead of tearing this down before it even begins, you could try giving it a chance. The room was silent again, save for the occasional cough or rustle of papers. Carson finally seemed to gather his courage and picked up the phone, dialing the number for the board chairman. As the phone rang, the tension in the room grew almost unbearable. Claire held her breath, her eyes darting between Carson and Elon. Ray, meanwhile, seemed unwilling to let the moment pass without another jab. Even if they say yes, you think the rest of us are just going to sit here and cheer? You've got no idea what it's like to be in our shoes. All your money, your fame. It means nothing here. This time, Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Ray for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his words were worth addressing. Finally, he said, "You're right again. I don't know what it's like to be you, but that's why I'm here. To listen, to learn." Ray snorted. "Yeah, sure. You're just another rich guy trying to feel good about himself." Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "And if I am? If helping this center, these people, makes me feel good, does that make it less valuable?" Ray opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and turned away, his body language radiating disdain. Meanwhile, Carson was still on the phone, his voice low as he explained the situation to the board chairman. Claire couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to know that Carson was struggling to convey the urgency of the moment. "This isn't just a donation," Carson said into the phone. "It's a chance to stabilize our operations for the foreseeable future. But I need your approval to proceed." Elon, who had been quietly observing, leaned closer to Carson and said, "Put him on speaker." Carson hesitated but complied, pressing the speaker button and setting the phone on the counter. A gruff voice crackled through the line. "Mr. Carson, you know we can't approve something like this without a formal vote. And even if we could, how do we know this isn't some kind of publicity stunt?" Elon stepped forward, his voice cutting through the static with quiet authority. "This isn't a stunt. I'm here because I can help, and I want to. But if bureaucracy is going to get in the way of that, then maybe this center deserves better leadership." The board chairman spluttered indignantly. "Now, see here." "No, you see here," Elon interrupted, his voice still calm but edged with steel. "You have an opportunity to make a real difference. Right now. Today. If you're too busy worrying about appearances or protocol to take it, then maybe you're not the right person for the job." The room was deathly silent, everyone's eyes wide as they took in the exchange. Even Ray looked momentarily impressed, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. The chairman's voice, now noticeably less confident, crackled through the speaker again. "Fine. But if this goes south, it's on you, Carson." "Understood," Carson said quickly, relief flooding his face as he ended the call. He turned to Elon, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Musk," Elon, "thank you. I don't know how to." "Don't thank me yet," Elon said, cutting him off. "The hard part's just beginning." The tension in the room didn't dissipate despite Carson's successful call. If anything, it seemed to grow heavier, like the air before a storm. Carson looked at Elon with a mix of gratitude and nervous energy, unsure of what steps to take next. Ray, meanwhile, sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes practically rolling out of his head. "So what now, Mr. Moneybags?" Ray sneered. "You got the board on your side, but that doesn't change anything for the rest of us. The second you walk out that door, it'll be business as usual." Elon turned his gaze to Ray, his expression unreadable. "That's the thing about change. It's never immediate. It's small steps that lead to big outcomes." Ray let out a hollow laugh. "Spare me the hallmark speech. Small steps? Big outcomes? Tell that to the families who come here with nothing, hoping for a miracle, and leave with less than they had when they walked in." "Ray," Carson interjected weakly, maybe we should what?" Ray shot back, his voice rising. "Play nice? Pretend that this guy is different? Because he's not. He's just another suit who thinks he can fix the world with his checkbook." Claire, who had been watching quietly from the side, finally spoke up. "Ray, you don't know that. Maybe he really is trying to help. Ray turned on her, his voice dripping with disdain. Oh, come on, Claire. You're smarter than that. Guys like him don't help people like us. They use us. For PR. For tax write-offs. For whatever makes them feel good about themselves. Elon stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. You're angry, Ray. I get that. And you have every right to be. But if all you do is tear people down, how does that help anyone? Ray stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You don't get it, Musk. You'll never get it. You live in a world where problems have price tags, where you can throw money at anything and make it go away. That's not our world. Elon didn't flinch. Then help me understand. Tell me what I'm missing. Ray stared at him, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually answer. But instead, he scoffed and turned away, pacing the room like a caged animal. The tension was unbearable. Carson shuffled papers nervously at his desk. Claire fidgeted with her scarf, and even the receptionist looked like she wanted to disappear. Finally, Elon broke the silence. Ray, he said, his voice steady, you have a choice right now. You can keep being angry, or you can be part of the solution. Ray spun around, his eyes blazing. And what exactly is your solution? Huh? Are you going to snap your fingers and make everything better? Because that's not how it works. Elon met his gaze, unflinching. No, it's not. But it starts with people willing to try. Ray opened his mouth to retort. But before he could, the door to the center swung open, and a woman stepped inside, her face etched with worry. She was holding the hand of a small boy, who clutched a battered backpack to his chest. Excuse me, the woman said hesitantly, her eyes darting around the room. Is this where I can get help? My son and I, we don't have anywhere else to go. Carson immediately stepped forward, his professional demeanor snapping into place. Yes, of course. Please come in. Let's see how we can assist you. But before Carson could lead them to a seat, Ray spoke up, his voice sharp. You're too late. We're at capacity. No more handouts today. The woman froze, her face falling, and the boy's grip on his backpack tightened. But, please, she said, her voice breaking. We don't have anywhere else to go. Elon's eyes narrowed as he looked at Ray. What are you doing? Ray shrugged, his expression cold. Telling it like it is. We don't have the resources for everyone who walks through that door. That's the reality. That's not your call to make, Elon said, his tone steely. He turned to Carson. Can you help them? Carson hesitated, clearly torn. We're stretched thin, he admitted. But I'm sure we can figure something out. Ray let out a derisive laugh. Yeah, figure something out. That's what you always say. And it never amounts to anything. Elon ignored him and crouched down to the boy's level, his expression softening. What's your name? The boy looked up at him with wide, wary eyes. Jason. Hi, Jason, Elon said gently. I'm Elon. Don't worry. Okay? We'll figure this out. Jason nodded slowly, his grip on his backpack loosening just a little. The woman, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of confusion and hope, finally spoke. Thank you. I don't know what we would have done if... You don't have to explain, Elon said, standing up and addressing Carson. Get them whatever they need. Food, shelter, clothes. I'll cover the cost. Carson nodded, relief washing over his face. Of course. Right away, but Ray wasn't done. You think that's going to fix anything? He snapped. One family? What about the hundreds of others? The thousands? Elon turned to him, his gaze steady. You're right. One family isn't enough. But it's a start. Ray shook his head, his expression hard. You're a fool if you think you can make a difference. Maybe, Elon said. But I'd rather be a fool who tries than someone who stands on the sidelines and does nothing. Ray glared at him, his jaw working as he struggled for a response. Finally, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room eased slightly with his departure, but it was clear that the conflict was far from over. Elon turned back to Carson. What's next? Carson hesitated, then said, we need to figure out how to make this sustainable. One donation won't be enough. Elon nodded. Then let's start brainstorming. We have work to do. The mood in the room remained uneasy after Ray's dramatic exit, but there was a renewed sense of purpose among the others. Carson busied himself preparing the necessary paperwork for the mother and son, while Claire quietly handed the woman a bottle of water and a few granola bars for Jason. Elon, meanwhile, remained standing in the center of the room, his presence commanding yet calm, as if he was taking in every detail and calculating his next move. The mother, who had introduced herself as Layla, glanced nervously at Elon. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said softly. "I just didn't know where else to go." "You're not causing trouble," Elon assured her, his voice steady. "You're doing exactly what you should, seeking help for your family. That's what places like this are supposed to be for." Layla nodded, but her unease didn't entirely fade. Jason, on the other hand, seemed captivated by Elon. He kept sneaking glances at him, his small hands still clutching his backpack like it held all his worldly possessions. "What's in the bag, Jason?" Elon asked, his tone gentle. Jason hesitated, looking at his mother for approval. When she gave him a small nod, he slowly unzipped the bag and pulled out a handful of drawings. Crayon sketches of superheroes, spaceships, and robots. Elon's face lit up. "Did you draw these?" Jason nodded shyly. "I like making things up." Elon crouched down to get a better look, holding one of the sketches carefully, as if it were a priceless piece of art. "This is incredible. You've got a great imagination." Jason's eyes brightened at the compliment. "I want to build stuff when I grow up, like robots and cars that can fly." "Well, you're off to a great start," Elon said with a smile. "Keep this up, and you'll be building things that change the world." Layla watched the exchange with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she murmured, "for being kind to him." Before Elon could respond, the door swung open again, and Ray reappeared, his face red and his expression stormy. "What's all this?" he demanded, gesturing toward the drawings. "This isn't art class." Elon straightened, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Jason was showing me his designs." Ray rolled his eyes. "Unbelievable. This is supposed to be a shelter, not a daycare." "Ray," Carson interjected, his tone firm, "if you're going to stay, you need to contribute, not undermine what we're trying to do here." "Oh, spare me the lecture," Ray snapped. "This place is a joke, and you know it. Band-aid solutions for problems that need surgery. And doing nothing is better?" Elon asked, his voice cool but pointed. Ray's gaze shifted to Elon, and his lip curled. "You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? Waltzing in here with your money and your speeches. You don't know the first thing about what it's like to live in the real world." "I know more than you think," Elon replied evenly. "But this isn't about me. It's about the people who come here looking for help. People like Layla and Jason." Ray let out a bitter laugh. "You really think you're a hero, don't you? Newsflash. Throwing money at problems doesn't make them go away." "No," Elon agreed, "but it's a start. And it's a lot more than standing around complaining." The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Carson looked like he wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how, while Claire stood frozen, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. Layla, meanwhile, pulled Jason closer to her, as if to shield him from the conflict. Finally, Ray stepped closer to Elon, his voice low and venomous. "You don't belong here. People like you never do." "Maybe not," Elon said calmly. "But I'm here anyway." Ray glared at him for a long moment before turning on his heel and storming toward the back office. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the room. Elon let out a quiet sigh and turned to Carson. "How often does this happen?" Carson hesitated, then admitted, "More often than I'd like to admit. Ray's been here a long time and he's complicated. He's seen a lot of hardship, and I think it's made him bitter." "That's not an excuse," Elon said firmly. "If he can't be part of the solution, then he's part of the problem." "I know," Carson said, his shoulders slumping, "but it's not that simple. He's one of the few people who stuck around, even when things got really bad. He's helped a lot of people, even if he's rough around the edges." Rough around the edges is one thing, Elon said. Sabotaging efforts to help people is another. Carson nodded reluctantly, clearly conflicted. I'll talk to him. Again. Good, Elon said. But in the meantime, we have more immediate concerns. What's the biggest challenge you're facing right now? Carson didn't even have to think about it. Resources. We're always running out of food, supplies, everything. And funding is a constant struggle. Donations come in waves, but they're never enough to meet the demand. Elon nodded thoughtfully. Then let's start there. Show me what you're working with and we'll figure out how to expand it. Carson blinked in surprise. You mean you want to? I want to help, Elon interrupted. But I need to understand the scope of the problem first. Carson hesitated, then nodded. Okay, I'll show you. As Carson led Elon toward the storage area, Claire turned to Layla and Jason, offering them a reassuring smile. Don't worry, she said softly. We'll take care of you. Layla nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to, Claire said. That's what we're here for. Jason, meanwhile, watched Elon leave the room with wide eyes, his drawings clutched tightly in his hands. Is he really going to help us? He asked quietly. Yes, Claire said, her voice firm. He really is. But as the door to the storage area closed behind Elon and Carson, the tension lingering in the room hinted that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Ray's anger was far from resolved, and the challenges facing the shelter were bigger than any one man could fix. Still, for the first time in a long time, there was a flicker of hope. A flicker that, if nurtured, might just grow into something powerful. The door to the storage area creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with shelves lined with mismatched boxes. Some were labeled in fading marker, others left completely blank. Carson flicked on a fluorescent light overhead, its dull buzz filling the silence. Elon stepped inside, scanning the sparse inventory. There were a few cans of soup, a couple of boxes of pasta, and some toiletries scattered haphazardly across the shelves. The air was musty, carrying the faint scent of mildew, and the floor was scuffed with years of wear. This is it? Elon asked, his tone neutral but his brow furrowed. Carson sighed. This is what we've got to work with. It's not much, but it's all we can manage. Donations have been down for months, and we're lucky if we can keep the lights on. Elon nodded thoughtfully, running his fingers along the edge of a shelf. What about the refrigeration? Do you have any capacity for fresh food? Carson pointed to a beat-up fridge in the corner, its paint peeling and a loud hum emanating from its compressor. That thing barely works. We mostly stick to non-perishables because we can't trust it to keep anything fresh. Elon leaned down, inspecting the machine closely. How old is this thing? Older than me, probably, Carson admitted with a faint chuckle. It was donated years ago. We've been patching it up ever since. Elon straightened, his mind clearly already running calculations. This isn't sustainable. If you want to provide real nutrition, you're going to need proper storage and a consistent supply chain. Carson sighed again. I know, but where's that going to come from? We barely scrape by as it is. And people like Ray, well, let's just say they don't make it easier. As if on cue, the door to the storage room banged open, and Ray stormed in, his face set in a scowl. What are you doing back here? He snapped, glaring at Elon. This isn't a field trip. I'm assessing the situation, Elon replied calmly, turning to face him, trying to figure out how to help. Ray let out a sharp laugh, the sound filled with derision. Help? What? By pointing out everything that's wrong. We already know what's broken around here, thanks. I'm not here to criticize, Elon said evenly. I'm here to find solutions. Solutions? Ray scoffed. Let me guess. You're gonna throw some money at it and call it a day? That's what people like you always do. You think you can fix everything with your checkbook. Money is a tool, Elon said, his gaze steady. But it's not the only one. Sometimes it's about finding the right people and the right approach. Ray stepped closer, his voice low and biting. You think you're the right person? Coming in here like you know better than the rest of us? You don't know a damn thing about what it's like to fight for every scrap, to feel invisible and powerless. Elon didn't flinch. "You're right," he said, surprising Carson with the admission. "I've never had to fight for survival like that. But I do know what it's like to build something from nothing, to face doubt and skepticism at every turn. And I know that change doesn't come from tearing each other down. It comes from working together." Ray stared at him, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "Spare me the motivational speech," he muttered, turning away. "You're wasting your time here." As Ray stalked out of the room, Carson let out a long breath. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "He's complicated." "He's angry," Elon said simply. "And anger can be useful if it's directed towards something constructive. Right now, it's just eating him alive." Carson nodded, though he looked doubtful. "I don't know if he'll ever change. He's been like this for years." "People can surprise you," Elon said, his tone thoughtful. "But they have to want to change. No one can force it." Before Carson could respond, the door opened again, this time revealing Claire. She looked flustered, her cheeks pink and her breath coming in quick bursts. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice urgent. Elon and Carson followed her back into the main room, where Layla stood near the reception desk, her face pale and her hands gripping Jason's shoulders protectively. A man in a rumpled suit was shouting at her, his voice loud and angry. Several of the other shelter residents were watching from a distance, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. "What's going on?" Carson asked, stepping forward. The man turned to him, his face red and his eyes blazing. "I'm here to collect what I'm owed," he said, jabbing a finger toward Layla. "This woman owes me 3 months' rent, and I'm not leaving until I get my money." "She doesn't have it," Carson said, his tone firm. "That's why she's here." "Not my problem," the man snapped. "She signed a lease and she needs to honor it, or I'll start taking her stuff." "You can't do that," Claire interjected, her voice trembling but determined. "This is a shelter. You have no right to come in here and harass her." The man sneered at her. "I have every right. She's a deadbeat, and I'm not letting her get away with it." Elon stepped forward then, his presence commanding. "How much does she owe?" The man looked him up and down, his lip curling. "Who are you? Her lawyer?" "No," Elon said calmly. "But I'm willing to pay what she owes, if it means you'll leave." The man's eyes narrowed. "And what's in it for you?" "Nothing," Elon replied, "except knowing she and her son won't have to deal with you anymore." The room fell silent, all eyes on the two men. The landlord seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his options, before finally nodding. "Fine. 3 months' rent plus late fees. Comes to $1,500. Elon pulled out his wallet and counted out the cash, handing it to the man without a word. The landlord snatched it from his hand, muttering something under his breath, and left without another glance at Layla. As the door closed behind him, Layla burst into tears, her hands covering her face. Jason clung to her side, his small frame shaking. Claire stepped forward, wrapping her arms around them both, while Carson looked at Elon, his expression a mix of gratitude and awe. "You didn't have to do that," Carson said quietly. "I know," Elon replied, "but someone had to." Elon Musk watched as Layla sat down with Jason, still visibly shaken from the encounter with her landlord. The room remained tense, the air thick with a mix of gratitude toward Elon and unease at the events that had unfolded. Carson tried to comfort Layla, but her distant stare made it clear she was still processing what had just happened. Elon stayed rooted in his spot, arms crossed, his mind already turning over the many issues the shelter faced. Meanwhile, Claire excused herself to attend to some of the shelter's other guests, but her worried glances toward Layla showed where her thoughts lingered. Elon could sense the layers of tension in the room, the challenges of running a resource-starved shelter, the pain of those seeking refuge, and the oppressive presence of people like Ray, who only seemed to add to the burden. Just as the atmosphere began to settle, the door slammed open once again. Ray reappeared, his posture stiff and his face set in a scowl. He carried a clipboard, slamming it down on the reception desk as if to announce his arrival. Several residents flinched at the noise, and a few even began whispering to one another. Elon glanced at Carson, whose shoulders tensed visibly. Whatever Ray was about to say, it clearly wasn't going to help. "All right, everyone," Ray barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. "Let's get something straight. This is not some charity free-for-all. We have rules here and they're meant to be followed. You can't just go handing out cash to every sad sob story that walks through the door." He shot a pointed glare at Elon, clearly aiming the remark at him. Elon raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I wasn't aware helping someone in need required your approval," he said calmly. Ray's eyes narrowed, his hostility now fully directed at Elon. "People like you don't understand how this works. You think you can swoop in, throw a few bucks around, and fix everything? This isn't some tech company where you can buy your way out of problems." "Perhaps not," Elon replied, his tone measured. "But I found that money can remove certain obstacles, allowing for real solutions to emerge." Ray took a step closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're a hero? Coming in here with your deep pockets and your holier-than-thou attitude? You're not helping anyone. You're just making a spectacle of yourself." Carson stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Ray, that's enough. Elon's just trying to help." "Help?" Ray scoffed. "He's undermining everything we stand for. This place runs on discipline, not handouts. People need to earn their way, not rely on handouts from some billionaire playing savior." Layla, who had been silently watching the exchange, suddenly stood up. Her voice, though soft, carried an edge of defiance. "You have no idea what it's like to be in my position, Ray. I didn't ask for his help, but I'm grateful for it. And if you think kindness is a weakness, then maybe you're in the wrong place." The room fell silent as everyone processed her words. Even Ray seemed momentarily taken aback, though his expression quickly hardened. He turned back to Elon, clearly unwilling to back down. "You think you're better than the rest of US, don't you?" he said, his voice low but venomous. "You think your money makes you untouchable. But let me tell you something. Money doesn't mean a damn thing here." Elon tilted his head, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Money is a tool," he said after a moment. "It's neither good nor bad on its own. What matters is how it's used. And right now, I see a lot of potential being wasted here, not because of a lack of money, but because of a lack of vision." Ray's jaw tightened, and he took another step closer. "You don't know a thing about this place, about these people. So don't stand there and act like you've got all the answers." "Maybe I don't," Elon admitted, surprising Carson and Claire with his candor. "But I do know one thing. Treating people with dignity and compassion isn't optional. It's the bare minimum." Ray sneered. "Spare me the sermon. You're not fooling anyone." Before Elon could respond, a commotion broke out near the entrance. A young man had stumbled into the shelter, clutching his side and gasping for breath. His clothes were torn, and a fresh cut on his forehead trickled blood. Several residents rushed to help him, guiding him to a nearby chair. Claire hurried over with a first aid kit, her hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. "What happened?" Carson asked, his voice sharp with concern. The young man struggled to catch his breath. "Some guys jumped me," he managed to say between gasps. "Took my bag. Everything I had." "Did you see where they went?" Carson asked. The young man nodded weakly. "Down the alley. Behind the building." Carson turned to Ray, his expression grim. "We need to call the police." Ray crossed his arms, his expression indifferent. "And say what? That some drifter got mugged? They'll take a report and move on. You know how this goes, Carson." Elon, who had been watching the exchange silently, suddenly stepped forward. "Stay with him," he said to Carson and Claire. "I'll handle this." Ray laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You? What are you gonna do? Wave your wallet around and scare them off?" Elon didn't dignify the remark with a response. Instead, he walked toward the door, his strides purposeful. Several residents watched him go, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. "Wait," Claire called after him. "You don't even know what they look like." Elon paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "I've got a pretty good idea," he said, his voice calm but firm. And with that, he stepped out into the night. The room buzzed with whispered speculation as everyone tried to make sense of what had just happened. Layla pulled Jason closer, her protective instincts kicking in. Carson paced near the reception desk, his worry evident. Even Ray seemed unsettled, though he quickly masked it with his usual scorn. "He's going to get himself killed," Ray muttered under his breath. Claire shot him a sharp look. "At least he's doing something." Ray didn't respond, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. For all his bravado, even he couldn't ignore the impact Elon was having on the shelter, on its residents, and on the fragile balance of power that Ray had worked so hard to maintain. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the shelter grew increasingly tense. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Elon to return. And though no one said it out loud, the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. What would happen if he didn't? Elon stepped out into the cold night, the wind slicing across his face as he made his way toward the alley the young man had pointed out. The dim streetlights barely illuminated the area, casting long, jagged shadows along the building walls. The hum of the city surrounded him, cars passing in the distance, muffled conversations, and the occasional blaring horn. Yet, here in the narrow, dimly lit alley, the world felt eerily still. Behind him, a few curious eyes peered through the shelter's windows, watching his every move. Inside, tension simmered like a pot about to boil over. Layla clutched Jason tighter as Claire paced anxiously, occasionally glancing at the door. Ray, as expected, was less concerned. He leaned against the reception desk, arms crossed and a smug expression plastered across his face. What's he even planning to do out there? Ray sneered. Hand out some cash and hope they change their lives? He's delusional. Claire shot him a glare. And you'd rather stand here doing nothing? At least he's trying to help. Ray shrugged, his tone dismissive. This isn't a superhero movie, Claire. He's just some guy with money. That doesn't make him invincible. Back in the alley, Elon's footsteps echoed against the damp pavement. He scanned the area, his keen eyes searching for any sign of movement. The alley was lined with dumpsters and discarded crates, the faint stench of rotting garbage wafting through the air. He could feel the weight of what he was walking into, but his resolve remained unshaken. As he turned a corner, he caught sight of a group of 3 men huddled together. Their low voices carried through the stillness, and Elon could see a backpack slung over the shoulder of the tallest one. It was the same backpack the young man had described, tattered and patched, but unmistakable. Elon stepped closer, his presence immediately drawing their attention. The tallest man, wearing a leather jacket with frayed edges, straightened up and fixed Elon with a glare. The other two, a wiry man with a shaved head and a stocky one with a scar across his cheek, turned to face him as well. "You lost, buddy?" The leader sneered, his voice dripping with hostility. Elon stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but firm. "That bag doesn't belong to you," he said evenly. The scarred man let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "And what? You're here to take it back? You got a death wish or something?" Elon didn't flinch. "I don't want any trouble. Just return the bag, and we can all walk away from this." The leader took a step forward, his posture aggressive. "Listen, old man, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not in charge here. So why don't you turn around and mind your own business?" The tension in the alley thickened, the air heavy with the threat of violence. Elon's heart pounded in his chest, but his exterior remained composed. He had faced high-pressure situations before, though none quite like this, and he wasn't about to back down. Inside the shelter, Carson was pacing furiously, his anxiety mounting with every passing minute. "We should have stopped him," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't safe." Claire shook her head. "He wouldn't have listened. You saw the way he was determined to go." "Determined or reckless?" Ray interjected, his voice laced with derision. "He's out there playing hero, and for what? To impress a bunch of people he doesn't even know." Layla, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "You don't understand," she said softly but firmly. It's not about impressing anyone. He just cares. Something you clearly wouldn't know anything about. Ray rolled his eyes but didn't respond, clearly unbothered by her remark. Back in the alley, the standoff continued. The scarred man stepped closer, cracking his knuckles. "You've got two options," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You can walk away, or we can make you regret sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Elon held his ground, his gaze steady. "How about a third option?" he suggested, his tone calm but resolute. "You give back the bag, and I make it worth your while." The wiry man snorted. "Oh, so now you're trying to buy us off? What, you think flashing some cash is gonna fix everything?" Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for them to see. "Not cash," he said, tapping the screen. "But I can call the police right now and let them handle this. Or we can settle it here and now. Your choice." The leader's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. The group exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. But before they could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind. The group turned to see Carson and Claire standing at the end of the alley, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. "What are you doing here?" Elon asked, his voice calm but firm. "We couldn't just stay inside," Carson replied. "You shouldn't be out here alone." The leader let out a bark of laughter. "Oh great, more do-gooders. What's the plan? Huh? You all gonna gang up on us?" Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're not here to fight. We just want to help." The leader sneered. "Help? You think you're helping anyone by sticking your necks out for a bunch of nobodies? You're all idiots." Elon took a step closer, his voice low and commanding. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the bag. It's about doing what's right. Something you clearly wouldn't understand." The tension reached a breaking point as the two sides stood face to face, the alley crackling with unspoken threats. The leader's bravado faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. "You're just a rich guy with a death wish." Elon didn't respond, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched on, heavy and charged, until finally, the leader threw the bag at Elon's feet. "Fine," he growled. "Take it. But don't think this is over." As the group retreated into the shadows, Elon bent down to pick up the bag, his movements slow and deliberate. Carson and Claire rushed to his side, their relief palpable. "You didn't have to do that," Carson said, his voice shaking. "You could have been hurt." Elon straightened up, his expression calm but resolute. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks," he said simply. The trio made their way back to the shelter, the bag clutched tightly in Elon's hand. Inside, the residents watched their return with a mix of awe and gratitude, their faith in humanity momentarily restored. But as Ray stood off to the side, his expression dark and unreadable, it was clear that not everyone shared the same sentiment. Elon carried the bag into the shelter, its weight seeming heavier now that the adrenaline had worn off. Inside, the tension was palpable. The residents stared at him, their expressions a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Carson and Claire hovered nearby, still shaken from the encounter in the alley. Layla clutched Jason tightly, her face pale but relieved. Only Ray remained indifferent, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and an unreadable look in his eyes. As Elon set the bag on the table, the room erupted in whispers. "Did he really get it back?" someone murmured. "He actually went out there alone?" another asked. Claire stepped forward, placing a hand on Elon's arm. "You shouldn't have gone out there by yourself," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That was dangerous." Elon offered a small smile, brushing off her concern. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Besides, everything worked out in the end." "Did it?" Ray's voice cut through the room like a knife. He pushed off the wall and sauntered over, his expression dark. "You think this changes anything? You think bringing back some stolen junk is going to fix all their problems?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Ray. Elon met his gaze, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It's not about fixing everything at once," he said evenly. "It's about taking one step at a time." Ray let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Spoken like a guy who's never had to struggle a day in his life. You think your money and your feel-good speeches are going to make a difference here? Newsflash, they won't. Ray, stop, Claire interjected, her tone sharp. He's done more for us in one night than you've done in months. Maybe you should take a step back and think about that. Ray ignored her, his attention fixed on Elon. You think you're some kind of hero? He sneered. Coming in here with your fancy clothes and your big ideas? You're just another rich guy trying to play savior so you can feel good about yourself. Elon didn't flinch, his gaze steady. If that's what you want to believe, that's fine, he said calmly. But I'm not here for you. I'm here for them. He gestured toward the residents, who watched the exchange with bated breath. Layla, emboldened by Elon's words, stepped forward. He's right, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. He didn't have to do any of this, but he did, and it means more than you'll ever understand. Ray's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the shelter, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Carson sighed, running a hand through his hair. He's always like this, he muttered. Thinks the world owes him something because he's had it rough. But he doesn't see how much he's hurting everyone around him. Elon nodded thoughtfully, his expression pensive. Sometimes people lash out because they're hurting, he said. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps to understand where it's coming from. Layla approached him, Jason still clinging to her side. Thank you, she said softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. For everything. You didn't have to help us, but you did. Elon crouched down to Jason's level, offering the boy a warm smile. Sometimes doing what's right is the only option, he said gently. Even when it's hard. The moment was interrupted by a loud crash from the kitchen. Everyone turned to see Ray standing in the doorway, his face red with anger. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? He shouted, his voice echoing through the shelter. You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything with your money and your self-righteous attitude? Ray, stop it, Claire shouted, stepping between him and Elon. You're making a fool of yourself. No, let him talk, Elon said calmly, his eyes fixed on Ray. If he has something to say, let him say it. Ray's hands clenched into fists, his body trembling with rage. You don't know what it's like, he spat, to struggle every single day just to survive. To watch the people around you suffer while you can't do anything to help. You come in here with your charity and your big ideas, but you'll leave. You'll go back to your cushy life and forget all about us. Meanwhile, we'll still be here, stuck in this hellhole. Elon took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. You're right, he said. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, but I do know that sitting around and doing nothing won't change anything. If you want things to get better, you have to be willing to fight for it. Ray laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Easy for you to say, he muttered. You've got nothing to lose. Elon held his gaze, his expression serious. Everyone has something to lose, he said quietly, and everyone has something to gain. The question is, what are you willing to do to make it happen? Ray stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the shelter. The room was silent once again, the tension thick in the air. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. I'm sorry, she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. He's always been like this. He's just angry. Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. Anger can be a powerful motivator, he said, but it can also be destructive if it's not channeled in the right way. Layla stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. We can't let his negativity bring us down, she said. We have to keep moving forward, no matter what. Elon smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. You're stronger than you know, he said. And you're not alone. We're all in this together. As the night wore on, the residents of the shelter began to rally around each other, their spirits lifted by Elon's words and actions. But in the shadows, Ray's anger simmered, his resentment growing stronger with each passing moment. The storm was far from over, and as the night stretched into morning, It became clear that the challenges ahead would test them all in ways they never could have imagined. Ray's anger didn't dissipate overnight. In fact, it seemed to build into something larger, a storm ready to explode at the slightest provocation. By morning, the shelter was already abuzz with murmurs about what had transpired the previous night. Word of Elon's intervention and the confrontation with Ray had spread like wildfire. While most residents saw Elon as a rare beacon of hope, Ray's bitterness had only deepened, and he was making sure everyone heard about it. It started at breakfast. The shelter's kitchen was a chaotic but welcoming place, where residents often gathered to help prepare meals together. This morning, though, Ray had positioned himself at the center of the room, his voice raised as he unloaded his frustrations on anyone who would listen. "Do you honestly think he cares about any of us?" Ray barked, jabbing a finger toward the dining area where Elon sat quietly speaking to Claire and Layla. "He's playing the hero, sure, but give it a week. He'll be gone and we'll still be stuck here." Carson, carrying a tray of eggs to the serving counter, paused and frowned. "You don't know that, Ray. What if he actually wants to help? Not everyone's out to get you." Ray turned on him, his expression thunderous. "And you're just eating it up, huh? Can't see past the dollar signs. That guy doesn't care about us. He's here because it makes him feel good." From across the room, Elon raised his head slightly, catching the tail end of Ray's rant. He didn't respond, instead quietly observing the scene. Carson set down his tray and sighed, shaking his head. "You're the one who doesn't care, Ray. You're so wrapped up in your own anger, you can't even see when someone's trying to help." "Help? You call this help?" Ray shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "He threw a bag of money at us and called it a day. Great. What about tomorrow? Or next week? What happens when that runs out? We'll be right back where we started." Claire, who had been standing nearby, finally lost her patience. "Enough, Ray," she snapped. "You're not helping anyone with this attitude. If you're so concerned about what happens next, maybe you should stop complaining and actually do something about it." The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, it seemed like Ray might explode. But instead, he scoffed and stormed out of the kitchen, muttering under his breath about naive fools and false promises. The incident left everyone on edge, and the atmosphere in the shelter remained tense throughout the day. Elon continued to quietly observe, occasionally stepping in to help where he could. Whether it was serving food, organizing supplies, or simply listening to the residents' stories. He didn't confront Ray directly, but it was clear that he was aware of the simmering conflict. By mid-afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. A group of shelter residents had gathered in the common area to discuss plans for improving their situation. It was a constructive conversation. Ideas ranged from setting up a communal garden to organizing job training workshops. But Ray, who had been lingering at the edge of the group, couldn't resist derailing the discussion. "Job training?" he sneered, stepping forward. "You really think that's going to fix anything? Most of you don't even have the skills to get a job, let alone keep one." Layla, who had been quietly listening with Jason on her lap, finally had enough. "Why are you like this, Ray?" she demanded, her voice trembling with frustration. "Why do you tear people down instead of lifting them up? We're all in this together, but you act like it's everyone for themselves." Ray's eyes narrowed, and his tone turned venomous. "Because I'm a realist," he shot back. "I don't live in some fantasy world where a billionaire shows up and magically makes everything better. Life doesn't work like that, Layla. The sooner you figure that out, the better." Elon, who had been sitting nearby, stood and walked over to the group. His presence was commanding, and the room fell silent as he addressed Ray directly for the first time. "You're right, Ray," he said calmly. "Life doesn't magically get better overnight. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Ray's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. "Easy for you to say," he spat. "You've never had to try. Everything's been handed to you on a silver platter." Elon's expression didn't change, but his tone grew firmer. "You don't know anything about my life, Ray. Yes, I've been fortunate, but I've also worked hard. And I'm here because I believe everyone deserves a chance to succeed, including you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, it seemed like Ray might back down, but instead he lashed out, his voice rising to a shout. I don't need your pity, and I don't need your charity. You think you're better than me, but you're not. You're just another rich guy trying to feel good about yourself. The outburst left the room in stunned silence. Elon didn't respond immediately, his gaze steady as he watched Ray. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. I don't think I'm better than you, Ray, but I do think you're better than this. Ray didn't reply. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the shelter, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. The residents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do or say. Finally, Claire stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. We can't let him bring us down, she said. We've come too far to let his anger derail us. Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. Anger can be a powerful emotion, he said, but it can also be destructive if it's not channeled in the right way. Ray needs to figure that out for himself. In the meantime, we have work to do. The group slowly began to disperse, returning to their discussions and tasks. But the incident left a lingering unease, and it was clear that Ray's presence, or lack thereof, would continue to be a source of tension. As the day wore on, Elon found himself reflecting on the events of the past 24 hours. The challenges facing the shelter were immense, and it was clear that there were no easy solutions. But he also saw resilience and determination in the people around him, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. Elon paced the shelter's cramped common room, his mind racing as he reviewed the conversations and conflicts that had unfolded over the past few hours. The resilience of the residents impressed him, but it was impossible to ignore the cracks in the system, widened by Ray's antagonism. He knew the underlying issue wasn't just Ray's bitterness. It was the environment that allowed such animosity to thrive unchecked. He glanced toward the door, half expecting Ray to storm back in at any moment, but the room remained tense and silent. Claire was organizing a group of volunteers to prepare for the evening meal, her voice calm and authoritative as she delegated tasks. Layla had settled Jason at a corner table with crayons and paper, though she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting another disruption. The rest of the residents moved with a quiet urgency, the day's tensions still palpable. Carson approached Elon, a clipboard in hand and a weary look on his face. We've got a new issue, he said, his voice low. Supplies are running dangerously low. I thought we had enough for another week, but with the number of people we've taken in recently, we're down to just a couple of days' worth. Elon frowned, his mind immediately shifting into problem-solving mode. What about your usual donors? He asked. Can they step in to fill the gap? Carson shook his head. Donations have been inconsistent lately. A lot of our regular supporters have been stretched thin themselves. And with the economy the way it is, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Elon nodded, understanding the unspoken implications. What about local businesses? Grocery stores? Restaurants? Have you tried partnering with them for surplus food? Carson hesitated. We've approached a few, but it's been hit or miss. Some are willing to help, but others, well, let's just say not everyone is as community-minded as we'd hope. Before Elon could respond, the shelter door swung open, and Ray stomped back in, his expression darker than ever. He carried a stack of flyers, which he slapped onto the reception desk with a loud thud, drawing everyone's attention. What now, Ray? Claire asked, exasperation clear in her tone. Ray ignored her, addressing the room instead. I've got an idea, he announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Since we're apparently relying on handouts from billionaires now, why don't we just turn this place into a photo op for rich folks looking to feel good about themselves? We can put up banners, roll out the red carpet, make it a whole spectacle. A few residents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether Ray was serious or just venting his frustrations. Elon stepped forward, his calm demeanor unwavering. If you have a legitimate suggestion, I'm all ears, he said evenly. But if you're just here to tear people down, you're wasting everyone's time. Ray's eyes narrowed, his anger flaring. Legitimate suggestion? Here's one. Stop pretending like you care. You're not one of us, and you never will be. You're just another rich guy trying to play the hero. Enough, Ray, Claire snapped. We've had it with your negativity. If you're not going to contribute, you need to leave. I'm contributing, Ray shot back, his voice rising. I've been here for years, doing the work no one else wants to do. And now this guy waltzes in, acting like he's going to save us all? It's insulting. Elon regarded Ray for a long moment, his gaze steady. If you feel insulted, that's not my intention, he said. But this isn't about you or me. It's about the people who rely on this shelter for survival. If you want to help them, great. If not, step aside. Ray's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he let out a bitter laugh and turned to the room. You all think he's some kind of savior, don't you? Just wait. He'll be gone soon enough, and you'll see how little he really cares. With that, he stormed out again, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. The room remained silent for a moment, the tension hanging thick in the air. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't know how much more of this I can take, she muttered. He's toxic. He's angry, Elon said quietly, and anger can make people do and say things they don't mean. But that doesn't excuse his behavior. What are we supposed to do? Carson asked, his frustration evident. He's been here longer than any of us, but he's poisoning the atmosphere. It's like he's determined to tear everything down. Elon was about to respond when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning as he read the message on the screen. It was from one of his assistants, informing him of a potential opportunity to secure additional resources for the shelter. But it would require him to step away for a few hours, a move he was reluctant to make, given the fragile state of the shelter. He glanced at Claire and Carson, weighing his options. I might have a lead on some additional support, he said finally, but it means I'll have to step out for a bit. Claire's expression turned anxious. Are you sure that's a good idea? Things are already so unstable here. I'll be back, Elon assured her. I just need to make a few calls and see what I can pull together. Carson nodded, though his worry was evident. All right, but be careful. Things are tense. Elon gave him a small smile. I've noticed. As he made his way to the door, he paused, turning back to address the room. Stay focused, he said, his voice calm but firm. This shelter is more than just a building. It's a lifeline for the people who need it most. Don't lose sight of that. With those words, he stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a wave. He pulled out his phone and began dialing, his mind already racing with potential solutions. But as he walked toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ray's anger was far from spent, and that the next confrontation would be even more explosive. Elon stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face as he made his way to his car. He scrolled through his phone, quickly pulling up the number of a logistics contact who might help with the shelter's dwindling resources. As the phone rang, he glanced back at the shelter. Through the window, he could see Carson and Claire talking animatedly, likely trying to manage the fallout from Ray's latest outburst. The residents moved about the common room, their postures tense, their expressions weary. It was clear that the day's events had taken their toll. The call connected, and Elon's voice dropped to a professional tone. This is Elon. I need a favor. It's about a local shelter. As Elon began explaining the situation, Ray was back at the edge of town, pacing in front of a dingy convenience store. His anger still burned hot, his fists clenching and unclenching as he muttered to himself. To him, Elon's presence at the shelter was a personal affront, a stark reminder of everything he despised about the world's inequalities. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands, his mind racing. Every interaction with Elon had felt like a challenge to his authority, a dismantling of the fragile control he had clung to for years. And now, the man was even trying to bring in more resources, something Ray couldn't twist into a narrative that supported his bitterness. A scruffy-looking man approached, someone Ray vaguely recognized from his past. Still fuming, huh? the man said, his voice low and mocking. Ray shot him a glare. What do you want, Pete? Pete shrugged, his greasy hair falling into his eyes. Heard you've got a billionaire hanging around the shelter. Thought maybe you'd finally found yourself a way out. Don't start, Ray growled, flicking ash onto the pavement. That guy's nothing but a fraud. Pete raised an eyebrow. A fraud? From what I hear, he's doing more for those people in one day than you've done in years. Ray's temper flared, and he took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know anything about what I've done for that place. Pete didn't back down, a smirk playing on his lips. Oh, I know plenty. You've got a knack for tearing people down, don't you? Guess it makes you feel big. Ray lunged forward, grabbing Pete by the collar, but Pete didn't flinch. Careful, he said, his voice a cold warning. You're already skating on thin ice, Ray. Don't make it worse. With a snarl, Ray released him, shoving him backward. Pete laughed, brushing himself off. You think you're the king of that shelter, he said, his tone mocking. But it looks like your reign's coming to an end. Ray didn't respond, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Pete was right, that Elon's presence was shifting the balance of power in the shelter. And the thought made his blood boil. Back at the shelter, Claire was trying to keep the residents calm. I know things have been tense, she said, her voice steady but strained. But we can't let Ray's negativity drag us down. We have to focus on moving forward. Layla nodded, her hand resting protectively on Jason's shoulder. He's just scared, she said quietly. That's why he lashes out. But we can't let him win. Carson, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. We need to start thinking long-term, he said. Elon might be able to help us in the short term, but we can't rely on him forever. We need a plan. As the group discussed their next steps, the shelter door creaked open. Ray strode in, his expression dark and his shoulders tense. The room fell silent as he made his way to the center, his presence commanding attention whether anyone wanted to give it or not. I've got something to say, he announced, his voice sharp. You all think this guy is your savior, don't you? That he's gonna solve all your problems. Ray, don't, Claire began, but he cut her off. No, I'm serious, he said, his tone growing louder. You're all so quick to jump on his bandwagon, but do you even know who he is? Do you know what he's really about? The residents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of where Ray was going with this. Layla stood up, her expression resolute. We know enough, she said. He's helped us more in a day than you have in months. That's all we need to know. Ray sneered. Of course you'd say that. You're all too blinded by his money to see the truth. But I'm not. And I'm not going to stand by and watch him turn this place into his personal PR project. Enough, Carson said, his voice rising for the first time. We're tired of your bitterness, Ray. If you're not going to help, then get out. The room was silent, the tension thick as Ray glared at Carson. For a moment, it seemed like he might leave. But instead, he turned to the residents, his voice low and menacing. You'll regret trusting him, he said. Mark my words. With that, he stormed out once again, slamming the door behind him. This time, the sound felt heavier, more final, as if a line had been drawn that couldn't be uncrossed. Outside, Elon was finishing his call, his expression thoughtful. He had managed to secure a donation of fresh produce from a local farm, as well as a potential partnership with a nearby grocery store. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it was a start. As he headed back toward the shelter, he spotted Ray lingering near the alley, his posture tense and his expression dark. Elon approached him cautiously, his voice calm but firm. We need to talk. Ray turned to face him, his eyes blazing with anger. There's nothing to talk about, he spat. You don't belong here. I'm not leaving, Elon said evenly. So we can either work together or we can keep butting heads. Your choice. Ray let out a bitter laugh. Work together? You really think that's going to happen? You don't understand what it's like to live like this. You never will. You're right, Elon admitted. I don't understand what it's like to be in your shoes. But I do know that anger won't solve anything. If you want to make a difference, you have to start by letting go of whatever's holding you back. Ray didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he turned away. Elon watched him for a moment before heading back inside, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Inside the shelter, the residents were trying to move forward, but the tension lingered. Ray's words had left a mark, and it was clear that his bitterness wasn't going to disappear anytime soon. Yet, despite the challenges, there was a sense of determination among the group, a resolve to rise above the negativity and focus on building something better. But as the day wore on, it became clear that the conflict was far from over, and the storm brewing on the horizon promised to test them all in ways they hadn't yet imagined. Elon stepped back into the shelter, greeted by a charged atmosphere that felt even heavier than when he had left. A cluster of residents had gathered near the common area, their voices low and tense as they exchanged worried glances. Claire was seated at one of the tables, her head resting in her hands, while Carson stood nearby, pacing in small, agitated circles. Layla was trying to distract Jason with a book, but her own unease was evident in the way she kept glancing at the door. "What happened?" Elon asked, his calm voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Claire looked up, her expression tired but relieved to see him. "Ray's stirring up trouble again," she said. "He left earlier, and when he came back, he started rallying people." "Rallying?" Elon repeated, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Carson stopped pacing and turned to face him. "He's trying to convince people that you're here to exploit us," he said. "Says you're just using the shelter for your own agenda." Elon took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. "And how are the residents responding?" Claire hesitated, then sighed. "Some are listening to him," she admitted. "Ray's been here a long time. He knows how to manipulate people." Elon nodded thoughtfully, his mind already racing as he processed the information. "Where is he now?" Carson pointed toward the back of the shelter. "He's in the storage room," he said. "He said he needed to take inventory, but we all know he's probably just planning his next move." Without another word, Elon headed toward the storage room, his footsteps steady and deliberate. As he approached, he could hear Ray's voice, low and conspiratorial, carrying through the thin walls. "I'm telling you," Ray was saying, "this guy doesn't care about us. He's here for the headlines, nothing more. Once he gets what he wants, he'll be gone, and we'll be left to pick up the pieces." Elon pushed the door open, stepping inside to find Ray standing with a group of 3 residents. They looked uncomfortable, their expressions conflicted as they listened to Ray's tirade. When they saw Elon, they shifted nervously, clearly unsure of how to react. "Am I interrupting?" Elon asked, his voice calm but firm. Ray turned to face him, his expression hardening. "Not at all," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Just having a little chat about the state of things." Elon stepped further into the room, his gaze steady as he addressed the group. "If anyone has concerns about my intentions, I'd be happy to discuss them openly," he said. "But spreading misinformation behind closed doors doesn't help anyone." One of the residents, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, spoke up hesitantly. "Ray says you're only here to make yourself look good," he said. "That once you're done, you'll forget all about us." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand why you might feel that way," he said, "but that's not my intention. I'm here because I want to help. Not for headlines, not for recognition, just to make a difference." Ray let out a bitter laugh, crossing his arms. "You expect us to believe that? People like you don't do anything without an ulterior motive." Elon met his gaze, his tone unwavering. "You're entitled to your opinion, Ray," he said. "But the truth is, I don't need anything from you. I'm here because I see potential in this shelter, in this community, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help it thrive." The residents exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions softening as they considered Elon's words. Ray, however, wasn't ready to back down. He stepped closer, his posture aggressive as he glared at Elon. "You think you're so much better than the rest of us," he spat. "You think your money makes you invincible." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Elon replied calmly. "And money doesn't make someone invincible. It's what you do with it that matters." Ray scoffed, his anger flaring. "You don't get it. Do you? You don't belong here. You never will. Before Elon could respond, Claire appeared in the doorway, her expression tense. What's going on in here? She asked, her voice sharp. We're just having a discussion, Elon said, his tone measured. Claire's gaze shifted to Ray, her eyes narrowing. Enough with the discussions, Ray, she said. You're causing more harm than good. Ray bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. I'm trying to protect this place, he said. From people like him. No, you're protecting your own ego, Claire shot back. This shelter isn't about you, Ray. It's about the people who rely on it. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, one of the residents spoke up, his voice hesitant but firm. Maybe we should give him a chance, he said, glancing at Elon. He's done more for us in one day than most people do in a lifetime. Ray's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The residents watched him go, their expressions a mix of relief and unease. Elon turned to Claire, his voice low. Thank you, he said, for standing up for me. Claire nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I just wish he'd see reason, she said. But I don't think he's capable of it. As they left the storage room, the atmosphere in the shelter remained tense. Ray's presence had become a shadow over the community, his anger and bitterness infecting everything it touched. And though Elon was determined to help, he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Elon stayed at the shelter well into the evening, keeping a watchful eye on the interactions and dynamics among the residents. The rift created by Ray's resentment was more evident now, with small groups forming throughout the common areas. Some people had clearly been swayed by Ray's narrative, while others rallied around Elon and the hope he represented. The divide was palpable, and it added an uncomfortable tension to the atmosphere. Claire and Carson were doing their best to maintain some semblance of order, but the cracks in the community were widening. The murmurs of doubt, the sideways glances, and the occasional heated exchange made it clear that Ray's influence was far from diminished. Elon, for his part, remained calm and composed, silently observing and strategizing. The evening took a turn when a heated argument broke out near the kitchen. A young woman named Sarah, who had been a vocal supporter of Elon, was standing toe-to-toe with an older man who had aligned himself with Ray. You don't get it, do you? The man snapped, his face red with anger. People like him don't care about us. They swoop in, throw some money around, and then disappear. He's not here to stay, and you're a fool if you think he is. And what about Ray? Sarah shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. What's he done for us, huh? All he ever does is tear people down. At least Elon's trying to help. Help? The man scoffed. He's not helping anyone. He's just making himself feel better. And when he's gone, we'll be worse off than before. Elon stepped forward, his presence immediately drawing attention. The room fell silent as he addressed the man directly. I understand your skepticism, he said calmly, but my goal isn't to make things worse. It's to find sustainable solutions that can help this shelter thrive long after I'm gone. The man crossed his arms, his expression hard. Words are cheap, he muttered. Actions are what matter. Then let's focus on actions, Elon replied evenly. What do you think needs to happen for this shelter to succeed? I'm listening. The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Elon's direct approach. But before he could respond, Ray entered the room, his presence like a dark cloud. Don't bother, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. He doesn't actually care what you think. He's just saying what you want to hear. Sarah turned to Ray, her frustration boiling over. Why are you like this? She demanded. Why can't you just let people try to make things better? Because it's pointless, Ray shot back. Nothing's going to change. Not with him, not with anyone. This place is a sinking ship, and the sooner you realize that, the better. Elon took a step closer to Ray, his tone steady but firm. If that's what you believe, then why are you still here? Ray's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he sneered and turned to the room. You all think he's some kind of savior, don't you? That he's going to fix everything. But mark my words, he's just like every other rich guy. He'll leave when things get tough, and we'll be the ones left to pick up the pieces. Enough! Claire's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. She stepped between Elon and Ray, her expression fierce. We're tired of your negativity, Ray. If you're not gonna help, then get out of the way. Ray glared at her, his hands clenching into fists. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. You're all blind. No, Ray, Claire said, her voice unwavering. You're the one who's blind. You're so consumed by your anger that you can't see the good that's happening right in front of you. The room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Finally, Ray turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the shelter, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Elon turned to the residents, his expression thoughtful. I know this has been a difficult day, he said, and I know trust isn't built overnight. But I'm here because I believe in this community. I believe in what it can become. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. We believe in you, she said. Don't let people like Ray bring you down. Elon nodded, his resolve strengthening. I won't, he said. But this isn't about me. It's about all of us working together to create something better. As the evening wore on, the residents slowly began to relax, the tension in the room easing slightly. But the shadow of Ray's anger still lingered, a reminder that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Outside, Ray paced in the alley behind the shelter, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control, that Elon's presence was unraveling everything he had worked so hard to build. And the thought made his blood boil. You think you're so much better than me, he muttered to himself, his voice low and bitter. But you're not. You're just another rich guy who thinks he can buy his way into people's lives. He lit a cigarette, the glow of the flame briefly illuminating his face. As he stood there, the shadows of the alley seemed to close in around him, mirroring the storm brewing in his mind. The next confrontation was inevitable, and as Ray plotted his next move, it became clear that the battle for the shelter was far from over. Elon's presence in the shelter had started to create a shift in the dynamic, and for many, it was a shift toward hope. But for Ray, the growing camaraderie and optimism were fuel to the fire already raging inside him. The residents, though still cautious, were beginning to envision possibilities they hadn't dared to before. Job training programs, better resources, and even partnerships with local businesses. Ray, however, saw these developments as a direct threat to the fragile authority he'd carved out in the shelter. That night, the shelter was quieter than usual, but the quiet was deceptive. Claire and Carson worked late organizing supplies and discussing potential improvements, while Elon retreated to a small desk in the corner, poring over plans for sustainable funding sources. The rest of the residents had retreated to their bunks, though whispers and murmurs carried through the dimly lit common area. Ray, however, was nowhere to be found. That alone set Claire on edge. Have you seen Ray? She asked Carson as she sorted through a box of canned goods. Carson shook his head. No, and honestly, I don't want to. He's been unpredictable lately. I wouldn't be surprised if he's off stirring up more trouble. Claire sighed, her worry evident. We can't afford another scene like this afternoon. The tension is already at a breaking point. As if on cue, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the shelter. The door swung open, and Ray appeared, his face flushed and his expression wild. He carried a crumpled stack of papers in one hand and a bottle of cheap whiskey in the other. The smell of alcohol hit the room before his words did. You think you can just take over, don't you? Ray slurred, his voice loud enough to wake several residents. He waved the papers in the air, his movements erratic. You think you're the big hero, swooping in to save us all? Elon stood, his calm demeanor unshaken. Ray, you've been drinking, he said evenly. Let's talk when you're in a better state of mind. I'm in a perfectly fine state of mind. Ray snapped, stumbling forward. And I'm done with your lies. You're nothing but a fraud. The residents who had been sleeping were now fully awake, watching the scene unfold with a mix of fear and curiosity. Claire stepped forward, her tone firm. Ray, that's enough. You're out of line. Out of line. Ray laughed bitterly. I've been here longer than any of you. I've put in the work. I've kept this place running. And now you want to throw it all away because some rich guy walks through the door. No one's throwing anything away, Carson said, his voice calm but resolute. We're trying to make things better. You're the one standing in the way. Ray's face twisted with rage, and he turned his focus back to Elon. You think you're better than me, don't you? He spat. With your money and your ideas. But you don't know a damn thing about what it's like to live here, to fight for survival every single day. Elon didn't flinch, his gaze steady. You're right, he said. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, but I do know that anger like this only hurts the people around you. It doesn't help anyone. Ray's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, it seemed like he might take a swing. But instead, he threw the papers onto the floor, scattering them across the room. You think you're so smart, he said, his voice shaking with rage. Well, let's see how smart you are when everyone sees what you're really about. The residents looked at the papers, confused. Claire bent down to pick one up, her brow furrowing as she read it. What is this? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Proof, Ray said smugly. Proof that he's not here to help us. He's here to help himself. Elon stepped closer, picking up one of the papers. It was a printout of a tabloid article, full of sensationalized claims and unfounded accusations. Headlines screamed about supposed ulterior motives, painting Elon as a manipulative billionaire using charity for personal gain. This is nonsense, Claire said, crumpling the paper in her hand. It's tabloid garbage. Maybe, Ray said with a sneer, but garbage has a way of sticking, doesn't it? Let's see how the residents feel when they know the truth. Elon held up the paper, his expression calm but firm. This is exactly what it looks like. Sensationalized lies designed to sell headlines, he said, addressing the room. But if anyone has questions about my intentions, I'm more than willing to answer them. The residents exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of Ray's accusations settling over the room. Sarah, who had been one of Elon's strongest supporters, stepped forward. I don't care what these papers say, she said, her voice steady. I've seen what you've done for this shelter. That's what matters. Others began to murmur their agreement, though the mood remained tense. Ray, however, wasn't done. He pointed an accusatory finger at Elon. You think they'll believe you forever? Sooner or later, they'll see you for what you really are. Elon met Ray's gaze, his tone steady. The truth always comes out, Ray. And I'm not afraid of it. Ray's face turned red with fury, and he took another swig from the bottle in his hand. You're not going to win, he said, his voice shaking. I won't let you. With that, he stormed out of the shelter, the door slamming behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Claire turned to Elon, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry, she said. He's out of control. It's not your fault, Elon replied. But we need to address this before it gets worse. The residents slowly began to disperse, though the tension in the room lingered. Elon knew that Ray's anger wasn't just going to disappear. It was building toward something, and it was only a matter of time before it boiled over. Outside, Ray paced in the alley, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control, that Elon was dismantling everything he had worked so hard to build. And the thought made his blood boil. I'll show them, he muttered to himself, his voice low and bitter. I'll show them all. The night stretched on, the storm brewing in Ray's mind growing darker and more dangerous with each passing moment. And inside the shelter, Elon prepared for the inevitable confrontation, knowing that the fight for the community's future was far from over. The next morning, the tension in the shelter was impossible to ignore. Ray's outburst from the night before had left the residents rattled, and whispers of uncertainty rippled through the common areas. Elon noticed the shift immediately as he walked through the space, his calm demeanor masking the concern brewing beneath the surface. Claire was already at work, trying to salvage some sense of normalcy. She moved between the kitchen and the front desk, her voice steady as she directed volunteers and offered reassuring words to the residents. Carson stood nearby, his posture tense as he scanned the room for any signs of trouble. "Have you seen Ray?" Elon asked as he approached Claire. She shook her head, her expression grim. "Not since last night. But honestly, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing." "It's both," Carson muttered. "When he's here, he's stirring up trouble. When he's not, it feels like the calm before the storm." Elon nodded thoughtfully, his mind already racing. He couldn't afford to let Ray's anger fester unchecked any longer. It was clear that Ray saw Elon as a threat, not just to his authority but to his identity. And that made him unpredictable. As Elon turned to head toward the office, the shelter door burst open, and Ray stormed in. His disheveled appearance and bloodshot eyes spoke volumes, and he carried an air of barely contained fury. "Morning, everyone," Ray announced sarcastically, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "Let's talk about our guest of honor, shall we?" The room fell silent, the tension thick as Ray made his way to the center of the common area. He held up a stack of papers, different from the ones he had brandished the night before, and waved them in the air. "More lies?" Claire asked, her tone sharp as she stepped forward. "Haven't you done enough damage already?" "These aren't lies," Ray shot back. "These are facts. Cold, hard facts about our friend here." Elon folded his arms, his expression calm but watchful. "Let's hear them," he said evenly. Ray sneered, his eyes narrowing as he flipped through the papers. "Did you know," he began, his voice dripping with disdain, "that Mr. Musk's company has been accused of unethical labor practices? That he's been criticized for mistreating workers and prioritizing profits over people?" The residents exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Ray's accusations settling over the room. Elon remained unfazed, his gaze steady as he addressed the group. "Let's address that," he said, his tone measured. "It's true that my companies have faced criticism in the past, and I take those concerns seriously. We've made changes to improve working conditions and address the issues raised. But no company is perfect, and I won't pretend otherwise." Ray scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Convenient response," he said. "But you can't just sweep your mistakes under the rug and expect us to trust you." "I'm not asking for blind trust," Elon replied. "I'm asking for the opportunity to prove myself through action. If you're willing to judge me, then judge me on what I do here, not on headlines and hearsay." The residents murmured among themselves, their uncertainty evident. Sarah, who had been one of Elon's strongest supporters, stepped forward. "We've seen what he's done for this shelter," she said, her voice steady. "And I don't care what these papers say. Actions speak louder than words." Ray's face darkened, his anger boiling over. "You're all fools," he spat. "He's playing you, and you're too blind to see it." Claire stepped between Ray and the residents, her tone firm. "That's enough, Ray. We've had it with your bitterness. If you're not going to contribute, then leave." Ray's hands clenched into fists, his whole body trembling with rage. "You think you can just push me out?" he growled. "I've been here longer than any of you. I've kept this place running while the rest of you sat around doing nothing." "That's not true," Carson said, his voice calm but resolute. "You've done more harm than good, and everyone here knows it." Ray turned on Carson, his voice rising to a shout. "You don't know anything about what I've done. You don't know what it's like to fight for survival every single day. And tearing people down helps you survive?" Elon asked, his tone even. "Because that's all I've seen you do since I got here." Ray whirled around, his eyes blazing. "Don't act like you understand me," he snarled. "You've never had to struggle a day in your life." "You're right," Elon admitted. "I haven't lived your struggles, but I've faced my own challenges. And I've learned that the only way to overcome them is by lifting people up, not tearing them down." Ray let out a bitter laugh, his anger now fully unleashed. "Spare me the lecture," he spat. "You don't belong here and you never will." The room fell silent, the weight of Ray's words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice low but firm. "Maybe he doesn't belong here, Ray. But neither do you. Not with this attitude." Ray's face twisted with rage, and he turned to the residents, his voice rising. "You're all sheep," he shouted. following him like he's some kind of savior. But when he's gone, you'll see. You'll see how little he cares. With that, he stormed out of the shelter, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Elon turned to Claire, his expression thoughtful. "That's not the last we'll see of him," he said. Claire nodded, her worry evident. "I know, and I'm not sure we're ready for what comes next." As the residents slowly began to disperse, the tension in the shelter remained thick. Ray's anger had reached a boiling point, and it was clear that the next confrontation would be even more explosive. But Elon remained calm, his resolve unwavering as he prepared for whatever came next. The tension in the shelter had reached a fever pitch. Ray's tirade the night before had left the community fractured, his venomous words echoing in the minds of the residents. Some still held onto their faith in Elon, appreciating the tangible improvements he had brought to the shelter. Others, however, had been swayed by Ray's relentless bitterness, their doubts now festering into quiet resentment. As the morning wore on, Elon focused on organizing the resources he had secured. His calm, methodical approach brought some semblance of order to the chaos. Claire and Carson worked closely with him, dividing their attention between managing the residents and keeping an eye out for Ray, whose absence felt ominous. Elon was in the middle of reviewing supply inventory when the shelter's front door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. Everyone in the common room turned to see Ray standing in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and a twisted grin spreading across his lips. Behind him were two unfamiliar men, both burly and rough-looking, their postures radiating aggression. Well, Ray drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like our savior's still here. I was hoping you'd be gone by now." Elon glanced at the two men behind Ray, his expression calm but watchful. "Who are your friends, Ray?" he asked evenly. Ray smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Just a couple of guys who know how to get things done," he said. "Unlike you." Claire stepped forward, her tone sharp. "What are you doing, Ray? This is a shelter, not a place for intimidation." "Intimidation?" Ray echoed, feigning innocence. "I'm just here to help. Thought I'd bring some muscle to clean up this mess you've made." The two men exchanged a glance, their smirks matching Ray's. One of them, a towering figure with tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped closer. "We heard there's a billionaire playing hero in here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Figured we'd come see what all the fuss is about." Elon met the man's gaze without flinching. "If you're here to help, there's plenty of work to do," he said calmly. "But if you're here to cause trouble, I suggest you leave." The man chuckled, his laughter cold and unsettling. "Trouble? Nah, we're just here to make sure everyone's comfortable." Ray crossed his arms, his grin widening. "See? They're on board. Maybe now we'll actually get some real changes around here." "Real changes?" Carson stepped forward, his voice incredulous. "Bringing in thugs isn't going to solve anything, Ray. It's only going to make things worse." Ray's smirk faltered, and his expression darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about, Carson," he snapped. "This place needs a shake-up, and I'm the only one willing to make it happen." "No, Ray," Claire said, her tone firm. "You're the one creating chaos. And if you think bringing these men here will intimidate us, you're wrong." Ray's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're all so blind," he muttered, following him like sheep. "But when this place falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you." Elon took a step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "If you really care about the shelter, Ray, then stop tearing it apart. Work with us, not against us." Ray let out a bitter laugh, his anger boiling over. "Work with you?" he spat. "I'd rather burn this place to the ground than let you take over." The room fell silent, the weight of Ray's words settling heavily over the residents. The two men behind him exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not expecting the situation to escalate so quickly. Claire stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "That's enough, Ray," she said. "You need to leave." Ray turned to her, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snarled. "I've been here longer than anyone. This is my shelter." It's not your shelter, Elon said firmly. It belongs to the community. And if you can't respect that, then you don't belong here. Ray's face twisted with rage, and he took a threatening step toward Elon. The two men behind him shifted uncomfortably, their bravado faltering as they realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Ray, stop, one of the men said, his voice hesitant. This isn't what we signed up for. Ray ignored him, his focus locked on Elon. You think you're so much better than me, he hissed. But you're not. You're just a rich guy playing games with people's lives. I'm not here to play games, Elon replied evenly. I'm here to help, but you're making it harder for everyone. Ray's fists clenched, his whole body trembling with rage. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out physically. But instead, he let out a bitter laugh and turned to the two men. You're useless, he spat. Get out of here. The men exchanged uneasy glances before backing toward the door, their tough exteriors crumbling under the weight of Ray's fury. Once they were gone, Ray turned back to the room, his face twisted with anger. You think you've won, he said, his voice low and venomous. But this isn't over. With that, he stormed out of the shelter, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Claire let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. Is everyone okay? Elon asked, his gaze sweeping over the room. The residents nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering fear. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. We're fine, she said. But Ray, he's not gonna stop, is he? Elon shook his head, his expression thoughtful. No, he said, but we'll be ready for him. As the tension in the room began to ease, Elon turned his attention back to the task at hand. The shelter's future was still uncertain, and the challenges ahead would be difficult. But one thing was clear. Ray's influence was waning, and the community's resilience was growing stronger by the day. Outside, Ray paced in the alley, his mind racing with anger and frustration. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control, that Elon was dismantling everything he had built, and the thought made his blood boil. But as he plotted his next move, it became clear that his anger was no longer just a personal vendetta. It was a storm brewing on the horizon, one that threatened to consume everything in its path. And the battle for the shelter's future was far from over. The shelter was quieter than usual, but it was the kind of quiet that carried a foreboding weight. The tension Ray had brought with his latest outburst lingered, like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Elon moved through the common area, his calm demeanor masking the unease he felt. Every interaction seemed charged with uncertainty, every glance tinged with doubt. Claire approached him with a clipboard in hand, her face etched with concern. We're running low on supplies again, she said quietly. That last delivery didn't go as far as we hoped. Elon nodded, his mind already turning over solutions. I'll make a few calls, he said. We'll figure it out. As Claire walked away, Elon noticed Sarah sitting in a corner, her shoulders hunched and her face drawn with worry. He crossed the room to join her, pulling up a chair. How are you holding up? He asked gently. She hesitated before answering, her voice low. I'm scared, she admitted. Ray's getting more unpredictable. And some of the others, they're starting to believe him. Elon's gaze softened. It's not uncommon for fear to take root in uncertain times, he said. But truth and resilience have a way of prevailing. Sarah nodded, but her worry didn't fade. Before either of them could say more, the front door slammed open with a force that made everyone in the room jump. Ray stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. Behind him were two unfamiliar figures, both men, lean and sharp-eyed, their expressions cold and calculating. You've got a lot of nerve, Musk, Ray spat, his voice echoing through the shelter. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? Elon stood slowly, his calm gaze fixed on Ray. I'm not here to take over, he said evenly. I'm here to help. Help? Ray laughed bitterly. You call this help? Turning everyone against me? Undermining everything I've built? What you've built is division, Claire interjected, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flashed with anger. You've done nothing but tear people down, Ray. And now you're bringing outsiders into this? What are you thinking? Ray's expression darkened. I'm thinking it's time for a change, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Time to remind everyone who really runs this place. The two men behind Ray stepped forward, their presence immediately intimidating. One of them crossed his arms, his stance casual but threatening. We're just here to observe, he said with a smirk. Make sure things stay fair. Fair? Carson barked, his disbelief cutting through the tension. You think bringing thugs into a shelter is fair? The man's smirk widened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in the residents, many of whom looked visibly frightened. Elon took a step forward, his posture calm but firm. This isn't a place for intimidation, he said, addressing the men directly. If you have something to say, say it. Otherwise, you're not welcome here. The second man chuckled, his voice low and mocking. Bold words, he said. But I don't think you're in a position to make demands. Ray's grin returned, and he pointed a finger at Elon. You see, this is the problem. He thinks he's in charge. But this is my shelter. My rules. You're wrong, Ray, Claire said, her voice unwavering. This shelter belongs to everyone here. Not you, not Elon. The community. Ray's jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. The residents watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. The first man stepped closer to Elon, his movements deliberate and menacing. Why don't we step outside and talk this over? He suggested, his tone dripping with mockery. There's nothing to talk about, Elon replied calmly. The shelter is a safe space, and I won't let anyone jeopardize that. The man's smirk faltered, and his eyes narrowed. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said. But guts won't protect you when things get ugly. Before anyone could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. You don't scare us, she said, her gaze locked on Ray. You think you're helping, but all you're doing is tearing this place apart. Ray's eyes blazed with fury, and he turned on her, his voice rising. You don't know what you're talking about. I've done more for this place than anyone. Enough, Carson shouted, stepping between them. His voice was like a thunderclap, silencing the room. We're done with your games, Ray. If you want to keep this shelter standing, you'll stop this now. Ray's fists clenched tighter, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he let out a bitter laugh, his eyes filled with venom. You're all fools, he said. Blind, stupid fools. He turned to the two men, his voice low. Let's go. We've wasted enough time here. The men hesitated, exchanging a glance before nodding. They followed Ray out the door, their heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the room began to ease, but the unease lingered. Elon turned to the residents, his voice calm but firm. This isn't over, he said. Ray's anger is escalating, and we need to be prepared. But we can't let fear control us. We have to stand together. The residents nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering worry. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady. We'll get through this, she said. As long as we stick together. Elon nodded, his resolve strengthening. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. The battle for the shelter's future was far from over, and Ray's next move would likely be his most desperate yet. The atmosphere in the shelter remained strained, with whispers of unease circulating among the residents. Elon kept his focus steady, his actions deliberate as he worked to rebuild the community's trust and maintain the fragile peace. But Ray's ominous departure with his hired muscle loomed over everyone like a dark cloud, leaving an undeniable tension in the air. Claire, Carson, and Elon had gathered in the office to strategize. Claire's fingers tapped nervously against the desk, her usual composure shaken. This isn't sustainable, she admitted. Ray is out there, and he's not going to stop. He's going to push until something breaks. We need to strengthen the community's resolve, Elon replied, his tone measured. Ray thrives on division. If we can unite the residents, His influence will wane. Carson frowned, leaning against the wall. That's easier said than done. He's already planted seeds of doubt in too many people. And let's face it, he's got the advantage of fear on his side. Elon nodded thoughtfully, his mind racing through possibilities. Fear is powerful, but hope is stronger. We need to give the residents something tangible, something that shows them this shelter can succeed despite Ray's sabotage. Before they could discuss further, a commotion erupted in the common area. Raised voices and the sound of shuffling feet drew their attention, and the three of them hurried out to investigate. What they found made Claire's heart sink. Ray had returned, this time with more than just his two hired enforcers. A small group of rough-looking individuals stood with him, their postures aggressive and their faces hard. They carried an assortment of tools and improvised weapons, an unsettling display meant to intimidate. "You didn't think I'd just walk away, did you?" Ray sneered, his voice loud enough to silence the room. "This is my shelter, and if you won't give it back willingly, I'll take it." The residents recoiled, some backing away in fear while others exchanged worried glances. Sarah, however, stood her ground, her expression a mix of defiance and fear. "This isn't your shelter, Ray," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "It belongs to all of us." Ray's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing. "You're just a kid," he spat. "You don't know what you're talking about." "She's right," Claire said, stepping forward. "This shelter isn't yours to claim, and we won't let you destroy it." Ray laughed bitterly, his hands clenching into fists. "You think you can stop me? You're delusional." Elon's calm voice cut through the tension. "Ray, this isn't the way to solve anything," he said. "You're only making things worse for yourself and everyone else." Ray's face twisted with rage, and he took a threatening step toward Elon. "Don't you dare preach to me," he snarled. "You don't belong here. You don't know anything about us." "I'm here because I care," Elon replied evenly. "And because I see potential in this community. Potential that you're trying to destroy." Ray's anger boiled over, and he turned to his makeshift crew. "Clear this place out," he ordered. "We're taking back what's ours." The group hesitated, their expressions uncertain. It was clear that not all of them shared Ray's conviction, but his fury was enough to keep them from backing down. As they began to advance, Elon stepped forward, his presence commanding. "This is a place of safety," he said, his voice steady and firm. "A sanctuary for people who need it. If you disrupt that, you're not just hurting me, you're hurting everyone here." One of Ray's enforcers paused, his resolve wavering. He glanced at the residents, who were watching the scene unfold with fear and desperation. The sight seemed to give him pause, and he lowered his makeshift weapon slightly. "Ray, maybe we should think this through," the man said hesitantly. "This is getting out of hand." "Out of hand?" Ray snapped, his anger flaring. "You're either with me or against me. Make your choice." The man exchanged a glance with the others, his hesitation growing. It was clear that Ray's grip on his followers was slipping, but his desperation only made him more dangerous. "Stand down," Claire said, her voice unwavering. "You don't have to do this." Ray's gaze darted around the room, his fury mounting as he realized his plan was unraveling. He grabbed a chair and hurled it across the room, the crash echoing through the space and making several residents jump. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. "You'll all regret this." The tension reached a breaking point as Ray lunged toward the nearest resident, his movements wild and erratic. Elon stepped forward, intercepting him and putting himself between Ray and the residents. "Enough," Elon said, his tone firm but calm. "This ends now." Ray froze, his breathing ragged and his fists trembling. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, but the weight of Elon's presence and the unwavering defiance of the residents seemed to give him pause. "You're all fools," Ray muttered, his voice barely audible. "Blind, ungrateful fools." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the shelter, his crew trailing behind him. The door slammed shut, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The residents stood frozen, their faces a mix of relief and lingering fear. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the group. "It's over for now," she said, "but we need to stay vigilant. Ray won't stop until he's brought down for good." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "This was a setback," he said, "but it's also an opportunity to show this community what it can achieve when it stands together." The residents began to murmur their agreement, the seeds of hope taking root despite the lingering tension. As the shelter slowly returned to normal, Elon knew that the fight for its future was far from over. But he also knew that the community's resilience was stronger than Ray's anger, and that, in the end, that resilience would be the key to overcoming the challenges ahead.